Callum Voss spent 14 hours alone in the death zone and walked out alive. That sentence sounds like a miracle. It isn't. It's the result of decisions made by people who were never supposed to leave him there in the first place. Here is what you need to know right now before anything else. On the night of September 14, 2021, Callum Voss was abandoned at 8,200 meters by the two people responsible for getting him down safely. His guide, Riku Tanaka, descended without him. His climbing partner, Sarah Blaine, followed. Neither of them radioed base camp to report that Callum was still up there. For 6 hours, nobody at base camp knew he was alone. 6 hours in the death zone, with no one looking for him, no rescue mobilized, no plan. He survived. But the story everyone thinks they know about that night is wrong. Most people who heard about Callum Voss assumed this was a solo climber who pushed too hard and got lucky. A hubris story. A man who bit off more than he could chew and somehow survived his own arrogance. That's the version Callum's expedition company, Summit Meridian, put out within 48 hours of his rescue. They framed it as a solo decision gone right. An adventurous client who deviated from the plan and made it back. Here is the truth. Callum didn't deviate from the plan. The plan deviated from Callum. And the reason Summit Meridian needed to rewrite the story so quickly was because the real version made them liable for his death. He just refused to die. There are 3 things this story is actually about. The first is a guide who made a choice at 8,200 meters that he has never been held accountable for. The second is an expedition company that destroyed internal communications before an investigation could reach them. The third is a man who spent 14 hours in conditions that kill most people within 3, and figured out, alone in the dark at altitude, exactly what kept him alive. 2 of those things were covered up. One of them changed how several high-altitude guides now operate. You're about to get all 3. Callum Voss was not a reckless climber. That matters. The influencer ignored warnings angle doesn't apply here. Callum had no social media presence. He had no sponsors. He was a 38-year-old structural engineer from Christchurch, New Zealand, who had spent 8 years working toward a single goal, reaching the summit of Everest via the Northeast Ridge. He wasn't there for content. He was there because he had made a promise to himself after his younger brother died in a hiking accident in 2013. He wanted to stand somewhere impossibly high and feel something he couldn't articulate to anyone else. He told this to his guide, Riku Tanaka, at base camp 3 days before the summit push. Riku nodded. He'd heard versions of that story before. What he hadn't heard, what none of them had heard, was the specific detail Callum left out. The one that would become relevant 14 hours into his night alone on the mountain. We'll get to that. Riku Tanaka was 44 years old. He'd guided on Everest 11 times. He was considered one of the more reliable high-altitude guides operating out of Kathmandu, with a reputation for conservative decision-making. His clients called him cautious. One former client described him as the guide who always finds a reason to turn back. That reputation is important, because on September 14, 2021, the guide who always finds a reason to turn back found a reason to descend, and he left a client behind to do it. Sarah Blaine was 31. She was a physiotherapist from Edinburgh. This was her second Everest attempt. The first had ended at 7,400 meters due to a chest infection. She'd spent 2 years preparing for the second attempt. She'd paid Summit Meridian $68,000. She would later become the most important witness in the entire investigation. Not because of what she saw on the mountain, because of what she signed. 3 people went up. 3 people did not come down together. And the 14 hours between those 2 facts are what this entire story is built on. By the time Callum was located the following morning, he had been at or above 8,000 meters for 22 hours. He was hypothermic. His oxygen had been empty for 7 hours. He had a frostbitten right hand and 2 frostbitten toes. He was sitting upright, conscious, and according to the Sherpa who found him, completely calm. He told the Sherpa his name, the date, and that he was ready to go down. He then asked if anyone had thought to bring a thermos. The Sherpa, a man named Dawa Gileson, had found a lot of things on Everest in his 16 years working above 8,000 meters. He had never found anything like Callum Voss. What kept Callum alive that night was not luck. It was not some superhuman cold tolerance. It was 4 specific decisions he made in the first 2 hours of being alone. Decisions that go against standard survival guidance. Decisions that every high-altitude expert who has since reviewed his account has described as either instinctively correct or the kind of thing you only figure out when the textbook isn't available. Callum himself says he has no idea where the instincts came from. He thinks it might be related to the thing he didn't tell Riku. The thing we'll come back to. But before any of that, before the night, before the abandonment, before the decisions that kept him breathing, you need to understand who these 3 people actually were when they arrived at base camp. Because the night of September 14th didn't begin at 8,200 meters. It began months earlier in 3 different cities with 3 different sets of expectations about what this expedition was going to be. And one of those expectations was a lie. Chapter 2, 3 people who should never have been alone together. Callum Voss arrived at Everest Base Camp on August 28, 2021. He'd been training for 3 years. Not casually. Seriously. He had a physiology consultant. He had an altitude simulation protocol. He had completed 6 preparatory climbs in the previous 4 years, including Aconcagua and Denali. He was fit, technically competent, and by every measurable standard, prepared. He was also grieving. 8 years after his brother's death, and he was still grieving. He kept it quiet. He didn't talk about it at base camp. He was sociable, easy company, the kind of person who remembers everyone's coffee order and asks about their kids. But the people who knew him well, his sister, his long-term colleague at the engineering firm, had watched him plan this expedition with an intensity that went beyond sport. This was repair work. He was trying to fix something inside himself by standing somewhere that felt impossible. His sister, Nadia Voss, begged him not to go, not because she thought he'd die, because she thought the mountain couldn't give him what he was looking for. She told him this directly 3 weeks before he flew out. Callum hugged her, told her she was probably right, and went anyway. He'd paid Summit Meridian $74,000 for a guided Northeast Ridge expedition. That price included a dedicated guide for the summit push, acclimatization support, and full logistics. The guide assigned to him was Riku Tanaka. Riku and Callum met for the first time at base camp. They had a 2-hour briefing. By all accounts, it went smoothly. Riku laid out the plan with the precision of someone who had given the same briefing 11 times. Callum asked good questions. Riku answered them. They shook hands. Neither of them knew the other well enough to know what the other was hiding. Riku was hiding exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, mental exhaustion. He had guided 3 Everest expeditions in 14 months. The previous one, in the spring 2021 season, had ended badly. A client had developed severe ASE at 8,400 meters. The evacuation had taken 31 hours and had required Riku to essentially carry the client through the most technical section of the route. The client survived. Riku was never the same after it. He hadn't talked to anyone about what that evacuation had done to him. He'd taken a 2-month break and returned to guiding because he didn't know what else to do. His wife, Yuki Tanaka, said later that she had asked him not to take the autumn season booking. She said he told her he was fine. She said she knew he wasn't. Sarah Blaine arrived at base camp 4 days after Callum. She was bright, driven, and carrying a specific pressure that nobody at base camp knew about. Her first Everest attempt, the one that ended at 7,400 meters with the chest infection, had cost her a sponsorship deal. A small outdoor apparel company had agreed to feature her on their website if she summit. She didn't summit. The deal fell through. She'd spent 2 years telling herself the second attempt was purely personal. But she'd also spent 2 years quietly rebuilding a sponsorship conversation with a different company. They wanted photos from the summit. She hadn't signed anything. There was no formal obligation. But the pressure was real. She and Callum got along immediately. They had similar senses of humor and similar approaches to risk. Measured, analytical, not given to bravado. She respected Riku's experience. Riku liked them both. From the outside, this looked like a functional team. The problem was underneath the surface. Riku was a guide who had been operating on empty for 14 months and hadn't told anyone. Callum was a man who had attached this expedition to something that couldn't be resolved on a mountain. Sarah was a climber with an unofficial deadline attached to her summit attempt. None of these facts were visible to the others, and none of them would become visible until 8,200 meters, on the night of September 14th, when pressure converted private facts into public consequences. The acclimatization rotations went well. 3 rotations over 16 days. No major health issues. Callum had some headaches at Camp 2.
Sera.
Slept badly above 7,000 meters. Riku was quieter than usual, but his performance was technically solid. The summit window opened on September 13th. The plan was to push from Camp 3 at midnight, summit in the early afternoon of the 14th, and return to Camp 3 by early evening. Rika said he had a bad feeling about it. He said this once at dinner on September 12th. Callum asked what kind of bad feeling. Rika said he wasn't sure. The weather looked fine. The route was in good condition. The fixed ropes above the balcony had been checked 2 days earlier. There was no objective reason for the feeling. He said it out loud, paused, and then said, "We go tomorrow anyway." Callum and Sarah agreed. That dinner was the last normal moment any of them would have for a long time. What happened in the 18 hours after they left Camp 3 on the night of September 13th will define all 3 of them for the rest of their lives. For Riku, it already has. For Sarah, it almost did. For Callum, it did something different. Something that surprised even him. But the decisions that set everything in motion weren't made at 8,200 meters. They were made at the summit. At 2:47 p.m. on September 14th, when all 3 of them stood at the top of the world, and one of them realized they had a serious problem and decided not to say so. Chapter 3. The decision that split the team. They summit at 2:47 p.m. on September 14th. All 3 of them. Together. That part is confirmed. The summit photos exist. Callum is smiling. Sarah has her arm around him. Riku is standing slightly to the left, his oxygen mask pulled down, looking at something in the distance. Look at that photo long enough and you notice something. Riku isn't looking at the camera. He isn't looking at the view. He's looking down the route they came up. He's already thinking about descent. At 2:47 p.m., a summit at that altitude means you have roughly 3 to 4 hours of usable daylight for descent before conditions deteriorate significantly. Riku knew this. He'd managed this calculation 11 times. The standard guidance is to begin descent immediately after a brief summit stop. They had been on the move since midnight, nearly 15 hours. They were tired. The oxygen was running lower than planned because Callum's regulator had been delivering at a slightly higher rate than calibrated. He still had oxygen, but the margin was thinner. Riku made a call. He told Callum and Sarah they needed to move in 10 minutes. Callum said he needed 12. He wanted to sit. Just for 12 minutes. Riku said 10. Callum said 12. It wasn't an argument. It was the kind of negotiation that happens between tired people who like each other. Riku agreed to 12. Those 2 extra minutes are not what caused what happened next. That is important to say clearly. 2 minutes does not change a survival outcome at 8,849 meters. What happened next was caused by something else entirely. At 3:04 p.m., they began descending. Riku was moving well. Sarah was slightly slower than on the ascent, but within normal parameters. Callum was the slowest. Not dangerously slow, but slower than Riku had expected. At 3:40 p.m., at approximately 8,600 meters, Riku stopped and waited. Callum was about 80 meters above him. Sarah was between them. Riku waited for minutes. Then he checked his own oxygen level. And here is where the critical sequence begins. Riku's oxygen was lower than Callum's. Not by a dramatic amount, but Riku had been working harder, guiding, route finding, carrying group equipment. His consumption rate on descent was higher. He ran his numbers. He had enough to get to Camp 3, but not if he waited significantly longer. He told Sarah this. He told her his oxygen math. He then said something that Sarah would repeat in court 2 years later, word for word. "I cannot wait for him. You can wait or you can come. But I need to go now."
sera weighted 20 minutes.
She watched Riku disappear below her. She watched Callum move slowly above her. She made a calculation of her own. Her oxygen was also lower than expected. She was tired. The temperature was dropping. She told herself Callum was close enough to Camp 3 that he would be fine. She started descending. She did not tell Callum she was leaving. She descended without looking back. She told herself she looked back twice and saw him still moving. In court, under cross-examination, she revised this. She said she thought she looked back. She was not certain. Callum reached the point where Sarah had been standing at approximately 4:10 p.m. He saw no one below him. He radioed Riku. No response. He radioed base camp. Weak signal. He made partial contact. Enough for base camp to hear his voice. Not enough for them to understand his words. He radioed again. Same result. He continued descending. At 4:55 p.m., at approximately 8,200 meters, Callum lost the route. Not dramatically. Not in a whiteout. In fading light with tired eyes, at an altitude where judgment degrades in ways you can't feel happening. He stepped left where he should have stepped right. He realized the error within 3 minutes. He tried to correct it and found himself on a section of terrain he didn't recognize. He stopped moving. This was the right call. Moving on unfamiliar terrain in failing light at 8,200 meters kills people. Stopping was correct. He found a small rock feature that offered minimal shelter from wind. He pressed himself against it. He checked his oxygen. He had approximately 45 minutes left at his current flow rate. He had no tent. He had no sleeping bag. He had his summit suit, his gloves, his face protection, and a small pack with 2 energy gels and half a water bottle. He turned his flow rate down to its minimum setting. He had roughly 90 minutes of oxygen at minimum flow. He radioed base camp again. This time the signal was marginally better. The base camp manager, a man named Joel Ferris, heard enough to understand 2 things. Callum was not at Camp 3, and he was alone. Joel immediately tried to raise Riku. Riku was already inside Camp 3. His radio was on. He answered. What Riku said to Joel Ferris in that radio exchange, and what Joel's log recorded, would not match Riku's later account to investigators. Not in minor ways. In fundamental ways. The kind of ways that suggest one version was constructed after the fact. The darkness was coming. Callum's oxygen was running down. And at base camp, a conversation was happening that would determine whether anyone came to find him, or whether the mountain got to keep him. Chapter 4. 14 hours in a place that kills in 3. The oxygen ran out at 7:23 p.m. Callum noted the time. He noted it because he decided, at some point in the previous hour, to treat the night as a problem to be solved rather than a death to be postponed. This is not bravado. He said later he wasn't brave. He said he was terrified. But terror, for Callum Voss, apparently produced focus rather than paralysis. And the first focused decision he made was to document everything. Not for social media. Not for anyone. For himself. A habit from engineering. When something fails, you write down exactly what is happening so you can understand it later. He was writing in the Notes app on his phone. At 7:31 p.m., 8 minutes after his oxygen ended, he wrote, "Breathing is harder. Not impossible. Keep movement minimal. Core stays warm. Extremities manageable. Right hand concerning." This is the first of 4 decisions that kept him alive. Decision 1. Stop burning oxygen through movement and keep a clinical record of his own deterioration. He knew what hypoxia did to cognition. He knew it would impair his judgment before he could feel it impairing his judgment. So he wrote notes. Concrete, observable notes. And he promised himself that if he read back something irrational, he would do the opposite. He read it back 3 times that night. Once at 10:15 p.m., once at 1:30 a.m., once at 3:47 a.m. The 1:30 a.m. entry is the one that worried him most. He had written, possibly warmer lower, go down. He read it back, recognized it as the kind of thought that kills people and did not go down. Decision 2 came at 8:50 p.m. He was shivering badly. The instinct is to tighten your body against the cold, to curl, to compress, to conserve heat through contraction. Callum did the opposite. He forced himself to make small, deliberate movements, not enough to exhaust him, enough to generate minimal heat. Controlled micro-movements sustained on a cycle. 30 seconds moving, 90 seconds still. He timed it on his phone. He did this for 4 hours straight. At base camp, Joel Ferris had mobilized. He had a Sherpa team ready to move at first light. He had been attempting radio contact with Callum every 20 minutes since 6 p.m. At 9:40 p.m., Callum responded. The exchange was brief. Joel heard, 8,200, rock feature, northeast, alive. Callum heard, coming at light, stay. He later said those 4 words were the most important thing anyone said to him that night. Not because they changed his situation, because they confirmed that the problem was now shared. Decision 3 was about water. Callum had half a bottle. He rationed it to small sips across the night, taking 1 sip per hour. This sounds obvious. It isn't. At altitude, dehydration accelerates cognitive decline and blood thickening, both of which increase risk of clotting. Keeping himself minimally hydrated was not comfort. It was survival mechanics. He had read something about this once. He couldn't remember where. He followed the instinct. At 11:45 p.m., the temperature dropped significantly. He could not measure it. He could feel it. His right hand was the problem. The glove on his right hand had a small tear at the wrist seam, not large, but enough at those temperatures to allow sustained heat loss. He had noticed this on the ascent. He had told himself he'd deal with it at Camp 3. He never reached Camp 3. Decision 4 was the hardest. He took off his right glove. He tucked his bare right hand into his left armpit under 2 layers. This exposed his hand to contact with fabric rather than trapped air, which was slightly more effective at transferring body heat. He kept it there for 2 hours. He lost feeling in 3 fingers. He didn't lose the fingers. He told the mountain rescue physician later that he wasn't sure he made these decisions consciously. He said they felt more like remembering something than deciding something. The physician noted this and asked if he had any unusual experience with cold environments. Callum said yes. As a teenager, he and his brother used to do cold water swimming in the rivers near their home. His brother had been obsessed with cold tolerance. He had taught Callum everything he knew about managing cold without panic. His brother, the one who died in 2013, at 4:15 a.m., the temperature reached its lowest point of the night. Callum's note at 4:15 a.m. reads, "Still here. Right hand has 3 numb fingers. Think about Nadia. Think about what I'll say when I call her. Keep breathing." At 5:30 a.m., the sky began to lighten. At 6:47 a.m., Dawa Gileson found him. Dawa had been moving since 4:30 a.m., before full light, because Joel had told him exactly where to look and Dawa had decided he wasn't waiting for sunrise. He moved with another Sherpa, Pemba Ongchu, who would later say that when they spotted Callum from below, they initially weren't sure he was alive. He was completely still, sitting upright back against the rock, not moving. Then Callum heard footsteps. He turned his head. He looked at Dawa. He said, "Good morning. I'm ready to go down." Pemba started laughing. He couldn't help it. He said later it was relief coming out sideways. The descent to Camp 3 took 2.5 hours. Callum moved under his own power almost the entire way. He needed assistance on 2 technical sections where his compromised right hand affected his grip. He ate both energy gels during the descent. At Camp 3, he drank 2 full cups of tea, put on dry gloves, and slept for 40 minutes. Then Joel Ferris told him something. Joel told him that Riku and Sarah had been at Camp 3 since 6 p.m. the previous evening, that they had both been in their sleeping bags when the Sherpas left for the rescue, that Riku had told the initial radio conversation to Joel that Callum had chosen to move independently, and that he believed Callum was proceeding to Camp 3 via an alternate route. That Joel had not realized Callum was truly alone and unplanned until the second radio exchange at 9:40 p.m., 3.5 hours after the separation. Callum sat with this information for a long moment. Then he asked Joel if Riku was still at Camp 3. Joel said yes. Callum said he'd like to go down a different route. Chapter 5: Recovery, Rescue, and the Accounts That Didn't Match. Callum reached base camp on September 16th. He had been evacuated by helicopter from Camp 2 to Lukla, then to Kathmandu, where he spent 3 days at a private clinic. His frostbite injuries were assessed as moderate. He would keep all of his fingers and toes. The right hand required wound care for 6 weeks. 3 fingernails were lost. He was otherwise physically intact. The physician treating him, Dr. Asha Pradhan, said she had seen hundreds of altitude injury cases. She said Callum's level of function after 14 hours without supplemental oxygen at 8,200 meters was, in her clinical experience, at the extreme end of the survivable range. She said most patients with comparable exposure histories were significantly more impaired, cognitively and physically. She asked him what he had done through the night. He showed her the notes on his phone. She read them quietly. Then she said, "You should write this down somewhere more permanent." He did, eventually, but not before everything else happened. Summit Meridian issued a statement on September 17th, 3 days after the incident. The statement described the expedition as a successful summit with a post-summit navigational challenge experienced by one client. It noted that the client reached safety through a combination of preparation, self-reliance, and the rapid response of Summit Meridian's base camp team. It made no mention of Riku Tanaka's descent without his client. It made no mention of the 6-hour gap before a rescue was mobilized. It made no mention of the radio exchange that didn't match. Callum read the statement in his hospital room. He forwarded it to his sister Nadia with a single line. "This is not what happened." Nadia, who is a solicitor in Wellington, called him immediately. Rika's account, given to Summit Meridian internally on September 16th, before any independent investigation began, stated that he had descended with client awareness, and that Callum had confirmed he understood the descent plan. Rika said he believed Callum was behind him at 8,400 meters and was descending under his own capability. He said he had no knowledge that Callum was off route until Joel's radio exchange at 9:40 p.m. Sarah's account, given separately on the same day, did not match Rika's on 2 critical points. Sarah said Riku had told her at 8,600 meters that he was descending immediately due to oxygen levels. This contradicted Rika's account, which claimed a gradual joint descent with increasing separation. Sarah also said, and this is the critical part, that Riku had specifically stated he did not have enough oxygen to wait for Callum. This implies Riku knew Callum was behind them and chose to move anyway. Rika's account implied he believed Callum was keeping pace. One of these accounts is a lie, possibly both. The Nepalese Climbing Authority launched an initial review on September 22nd. They requested all radio logs, expedition records, and client documentation from Summit Meridian. Summit Meridian provided partial records. The radio log from Joel Ferris, the one containing the 6 p.m. exchange with Riku, was listed as not recoverable due to equipment malfunction. Joel had a handwritten backup log. Summit Meridian did not include it in the disclosure. Joel Ferris resigned from Summit Meridian on October 4th. He gave no public reason. He did not speak to press. He took his handwritten log with him. Meanwhile, the climbing community online had already developed its own version of events. The early narrative was flattering to Callum and vague about Riku. Most people didn't know enough detail to assign specific blame. A few Everest forums had threads speculating about the guide's situation, but without confirmed information, it was mostly noise. Callum gave one interview in October 2021 to a New Zealand outdoor magazine. He described the night in calm, specific terms. He said his guide had descended separately. He did not call it abandonment. He said the investigation would determine what had happened. He said he harbored no anger. He seemed to mean it, which confused people who were expecting him to be angrier. He told the magazine one other thing. He said that at some point during the night, he had started talking to his brother. Not out loud. Inside his head. He'd had whole conversations with him. He said his brother had always been the calmer one in difficult situations. He said it helped. The interviewer asked if he believed in something beyond death. Callum said he didn't know. He said he knew it helped. He said that was enough. The full investigation, independent, not Summit Meridian's internal process, began in January 2022. And what it found when it finally obtained Joel Ferris's handwritten log was not what Summit Meridian had told anyone. The radio exchange at 6 p.m. had not been a brief check-in. It had been a 6-minute exchange. And in that exchange, according to Joel's log, Riku had been told that Callum had not yet arrived at Camp 3. He had been told that Callum's last radio contact had placed him somewhere above 8,200 meters. He had been told that Callum was not responding clearly. And Joel's log recorded Riku's response as 4 words. He knows the route. That was it. No offer to go back up. No request for a rescue mobilization. No acknowledgement of urgency. 4 words, and then Riku signed off. The investigation also found something else. Something that nobody at Summit Meridian had disclosed, and that Riku had not mentioned in his account. Chapter 6: What Summit Meridian Tried to Erase. Riku Tanaka had done this before. Not exactly this, but close enough that when the investigators found the documentation, the pattern was impossible to dismiss. In the spring 2018 season, Riku had been guiding a client named Benson Rao on the South Col route. Benson was an experienced climber. He was also slower than expected on descent from the summit. At 8,300 meters, Benson fell behind significantly. Riku descended to the South Col and told base camp that Benson was managing independently. Benson managed independently for 4 hours in deteriorating conditions before reaching Camp 4. He survived. He had mild frostbite on both ears. He filed no complaint. He filed no complaint because Summit Meridian contacted him within 48 hours of his return to Kathmandu and offered him a full refund plus a credit toward a future expedition. He signed a document confirming he had no outstanding concerns related to guide performance. He took the refund. He never climbed with Summit Meridian again. The investigators found this through Benson Rao himself. He had not been hard to find. He had no NDA. Summit Meridian had apparently not thought a release document was necessary in 2018. He had simply been bought into silence with a refund and a handshake. When contacted by investigators in February 2022, he told them everything immediately. He said he had thought about calling someone for 3 years. He said he didn't know who to call. Here is the thing that matters most about this. Summit Meridian knew about the 2018 incident. Their managing director, a man named Frederick Holt, had conducted an internal review at the time. That review had concluded that Riku's behavior was within acceptable guide discretion given client competence. They had kept Riku on. They had not disclosed the incident to any subsequent clients, including Callum Voss. When Callum paid $74,000 for a guided summit attempt with Riku Tanaka, he was not told he was hiring a guide who had previously descended without a client at high altitude and had been retained despite that fact. This is the part that Callum's sister Nadia focused on when she filed the civil lawsuit in March 2022. Not the individual decision Riku made on September 14th. The institutional decision Summit Meridian made in 2018 to retain Riku without disclosure. That decision, she argued, had put Callum in foreseeable danger. The lawsuit proceeded for 14 months. Sarah Blaine was deposed in June 2022. Her deposition lasted 4 hours. She changed her account on 3 points from her original statement to Summit Meridian. The most significant change. She confirmed that at 8,600 meters, she had heard Riku say explicitly that he was descending because of oxygen and that he did not have capacity to wait. She confirmed she had understood this to mean Callum would be alone. She confirmed she had chosen to follow Riku. She said she had told herself this was acceptable because she believed Callum was capable of descending alone. Under cross-examination, she was asked if she had informed Callum he was being left. She said no. She was asked why. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't have a good answer for that." She has not climbed since September 14, 2021. Frederick Holt, Summit Meridian's managing director, gave a deposition in August 2022. He claimed no knowledge that the 2018 internal review had found conduct comparable to the 2021 incident. He claimed the two situations were categorically different. He claimed Summit Meridian had always prioritized client safety above commercial considerations. He was then shown an internal email from October 2021, 3 weeks after Callum's incident, in which Holt wrote to Summit Meridian's legal counsel, "We need this framed as client deviation before the investigation starts." Holt said the email was taken out of context. The settlement was reached in May 2023. The terms are confidential. Callum has not discussed the amount. He has said publicly that the settlement was not the point. Nadia has said the process revealed everything it needed to reveal. Summit Meridian continues to operate. Riku Tanaka has not guided on Everest since September 2021. He has not spoken publicly. Here is the thing that the climbing community argued about for 2 years following this case. Everyone agreed Riku made a bad decision. The debate was about degree. Some guides argued that oxygen math at extreme altitude creates genuine impossible choices, that Riku may have truly believed that descending was the only option and that Callum could manage alone. Others argued that the 2018 incident and the radio exchange proved this wasn't a one-time cognitive failure under altitude stress. It was a pattern. A guide who, under pressure, consistently prioritized his own descent over his client's welfare. Most people believe the straightforward answer here is that Riku Tanaka is a bad guide who should never have been allowed back on the mountain after 2018. But the actual picture is more complicated and more disturbing. Riku had 10 flawless guided summits. He had genuine competence. What the evidence suggests is not a consistently incompetent guide, but a guide who had been broken by the 2021 spring evacuation and sent back into the field before he was ready, by a company that needed his skill set and ignored what the cost of using him might be. Summit Meridian didn't send a bad guide up with Callum Voss. They sent a damaged one. And they knew it. And they sent him anyway. That is the original sin of this story. Not one man's decision at 8,600 meters. An institution's decision to treat a human being as a recoverable resource rather than a person who needed help. And then to deploy that person in a role where his unresolved damage could transfer directly onto someone else's survival odds. The climbing community has not fully reckoned with this. The conversation tends to collapse back onto individual blame, Riku, Sarah, Callum's own choices. The structural question, what obligations do commercial expedition companies have to both guides and clients, remains largely unresolved. That question will matter again. It always does. Chapter 7. What he carries down with him. 3 things changed directly because of what happened to Callum Voss. The first is a regulatory change implemented by the Nepalese Climbing Authority in April 2023. Commercial expedition companies operating above 8,000 meters on Everest are now required to maintain direct radio contact with all clients above 7,500 meters. Radio logs must be preserved in digital format and submitted to the authority within 72 hours of any incident. The not recoverable due to equipment malfunction defense that Summit Meridian used is no longer usable. If the log doesn't exist, the company assumes full liability. This is a small change. It will not prevent the next abandonment, but it will make it significantly harder to conceal. The second change is internal to 3 Nepalese expedition companies, all of whom reviewed their guide welfare protocols following the civil case. 2 of them now require guides to submit to a structured psychological review before being assigned to high-altitude summit expeditions. The review assesses burnout, unresolved trauma, and readiness. It is voluntary in the sense that guides can decline, but declining without explanation is noted. The hope is that a guide in Riku's state in 2021 would either self-identify or be identified before being assigned. This is also small, and it depends entirely on guides trusting that self-identifying does not end their careers. The third change is Callum himself. He returned to engineering after his recovery. He is still working at the same firm. He still lives in Christchurch. He did not write a book. He gave a total of 4 interviews in the 2 years following the incident, all of them careful, specific, and notably free of the kind of dramatic framing that a story like his typically attracts. He doesn't perform what happened to him. He describes it. In early 2023, he began speaking to hospital patients with severe cold injuries, frostbite cases, hypothermia survivors. He went through a formal volunteer program. He does not lecture them or tell them what he did. He sits with them. He talks about what the cold feels like from the inside. The patients, almost universally, say the same thing. It helps to talk to someone who was actually there. Nadia says he seems different. Not healed. She doesn't use that word. She says he seems like he found something he went looking for, even if the mountain wasn't where he found it. She thinks he found it in the 14 hours alone on the rock feature at 8,200 meters, talking to his brother in his head, keeping notes, doing the work of staying alive with the only tools he had. She says she still wishes he hadn't gone. He says he knows. Dawa Gileson, the Sherpa who found Callum at 6:47 a.m. on September 15th, has guided 2 subsequent Everest seasons. He doesn't talk about the rescue in detail. When asked about it, he gives a short version. Early departure, good visibility, found him sitting up. He says the thing he remembers most is how calm Callum seemed. He says he has found a lot of things on that mountain. He says calm is rarer than survival. Pemba Ongchu, who climbed with Dawa that morning, said in a single online comment on a Sherpa climbing forum in 2022, "We expected to find a body. We found a man waiting for us. It was the best morning I have had on that mountain. Callum's body is not on Everest. He came down. His notes are on his phone, backed up in 2 places. He has shown them to 4 people. His sister, Dr. Asha Pradhan, the editor of the outdoor magazine, and one of the hospital patients he volunteers with. A 19-year-old who lost 2 fingers to frostbite in a mountaineering accident and was struggling to accept it. Callum showed him the 4:15 a.m. entry. The one that says, still here. Right hand has 3 numb fingers. Think about Nadia. Think about what I'll say when I call her. Keep breathing." He told the kid, "The point isn't that I survived. The point is that surviving is a decision you keep making every hour. You don't make it once. You make it over and over, in the dark, when you're not sure if the next hour is going to give you anything worth staying for. And then the sun comes up, and Dawa Gileson walks around a rock and tells you that breakfast is waiting at Camp 3. The kid asked Callum if he'd ever go back. Callum said he didn't know. He said the mountain gave him the 14 hours. He's not sure it owes him anything else. Here's what this story is actually about, underneath the lawsuit and the guide and the company and the settlement. Callum Voss went to Everest to fix a grief that had been living in him for 8 years. He didn't fix it on the summit. He didn't fix it in the 14 hours on the rock. He fixed it, if fixed is even the right word, by talking to a dead man in his head while his oxygen ran out, and realizing that his brother was still inside him somehow, in the cold tolerance and the calm and the instinct to keep notes and not panic. He'd been carrying that all along. The mountain didn't give him that. His brother did. 18 years before the expedition, in the rivers near their home, teaching a teenager how to stay calm when everything feels impossible. Some warnings save lives. Some of them were delivered years before the danger arrived. What do you think kept Callum alive? Was it preparation? Luck? His brother's voice in his head? Or something the mountain decided? Tell us in the comments. Every answer is probably a little bit right. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the full investigation, every angle, nothing left out, subscribe. We are covering the Karpa Glacier expedition next, where a team of 6 made the summit in record time, and 3 of them never left it. The reason they didn't is not what anyone reported at the time. It almost never is. The mountain keeps its secrets poorly. We just have to be willing to go looking.